Hey, good people. I hope you're all well. I thought I would take a moment to record this week's lecture, which is lecture 1 for HSP216 in week 6. And we're focused on police deviance and corruption. Now, we've got 2 lectures this week, and the second one is focused on police ethics because the two of them are kind of connected very readily. So, at the end of this lecture, I'm hoping that you just understand a little bit more about police deviance and corruption and what that means and all of that sort of jazz. We have a lot of expectations of our police officers. We expect them to be competent, to uphold the laws, to be accountable, of course, and to provide transparency with their different behaviours and practices in order to appear more accountable overall. We also expect them to not abuse police power, not use their office for illegitimate or personal gain, and to use tax resources wisely, right? Because we often pay taxes that go into their pay packets. Many of these ideals are commonly not achieved. A lot of them are just considered to be ideals, and there's a lot of different factors which get in the way that influence the push and pull things that lead to the outcomes or the achievement of these particular expectations. And of course, we know that police failure to meet these public expectations means that the confidence that the public have in the police it's very much diminished. So why do we need to talk about police corruption then? Because this confidence can be shattered so easily, and corruption is most commonly the thing that's talked about as having the largest impact on that confidence. So, for instance, things like police moving from a force to a service, and that is a nomenclature thing, the way that they change their name, but they also try sometimes to change their overall approach. So, for example, this happened after royal commissions in Queensland, New South Wales and WA, and this they hoped would change the way that police work happened, rather than moving away from the idea that it's just about, these royal commissions were just about exposing the corruption. It was also about changing the way that they did these forms of work. Interestingly enough, police and the media are also seen to be forces for morally good work. One of the other reasons why we need to think about corruption is that police and the media are definitely seen as a force for good. But interestingly enough, they're also still expected to bend the rules a bit. And in some ways, this links with the roles that they do for catching crooks and things like that. So, for instance, noble cause corruption, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. One of the international organisations that we have that look at corruption is called Transparency International. Now, this is not necessarily something where they are physically looking at the way that corruption happens across different organisations. They don't collect data about that. They actually collect data about the perceptions of corruption. And this data is collected from people that live in the local communities. Some of the lowest scorers at the moment that Transparency International watches are those countries that have a lot of conflict. So Angola, South Sudan, Afghanistan, North Korea and Somalia all have very low scores on their Transparency International scale, which means that the people in their local communities have very high perceptions of, they think that there's a lot of corruption in their local communities. And so those perceptions come from that entrenched conflict a lot of the time. This is just one way that we watch corruption internationally. As you know already, police culture has a significant role to play when it comes to misconduct and corruption. And these types of subcultures in larger organisations, and of course police is one of these, they may develop when they see themselves as being untreated fairly or unappreciated by the general public. And that's where that sort of, tension comes between the public and the police. And this most often comes out in the forms of what we call police cynicism, which is, of course, part of what the original research talks about as part of a police personality too. What is police corruption then, and what does it look like? There's a range of different things that we can recognisably say are police corruption. So in Article 7 of the UN Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Officials, we can see that law enforcement officials shall not commit any act of corruption. They shall be rigorously opposed to and combat all such acts. And an act of corruption is, in the same way as any other abuse of authority, incompatible with the profession of law enforcement. While the definition of corruption may be subject to national law, it should be understood to encompass the commission or omission of an act in the performance or in connection of one's duties as an officer in response to gifts, promises, or incentives demanded or accepted, or the wrongful receipt of these once the act has been committed or omitted. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that the research talks about why these types of police corruption happen too. And some of the things that they talk about relate to different ideas about moral vulnerability in particular. So police officers' morals can be eroded over time because the job requires you to do a whole bunch of different things which other people might not have a role in, for instance. So number one, they use morally problematic means to detect crime by using surveillance, for instance, which would be considered a form of stalking if I was to do it, because I'm not a police officer. They also have to keep company with people who are morally corrupt. They need to interview people as witnesses and things like that to other forms of crime. And of course, they need to sometimes work in conjunction with people who are criminals in order to get information to be able to get to people who are actually perpetrating much more serious forms of crime. They also endure a high number of what we call lose-lose policing situations where it fails to have a positive outcome. Family violence is a really good example of this, where an officer might be called repeatedly over the course of a week or a month to the same house for the same reason and not unfortunately be able to action anything other than the same thing that they did last time they attended that house. And of course, there's hanging around with people that use and sell illegal drugs. Big money can change people's lives significantly, and if they get offered something, then they might take it. There's some causes of corruption as well that they discuss in the literature. There's what they call the Sisyphean nature of policing. That means that it can seem endless, pointless labour where they don't ever get anything out of it at the end. And there's not a lot of resolution. This is particularly demonstrated well by family violence incidents where they do constantly go out to the same houses where they just literally haven't got any way of moving forward. It's just the same thing every day. There's also cynicism, where they might turn up expecting the worst and then perform in particular ways. You know, they might yell at somebody who really doesn't require being yelled at and things like that. There's moral ambiguity around different policing methods. For example, arrest is lawful, kidnap and assault. There's the moral corrosiveness of the job as well, that there's a lot of psychological trauma and burnout. There's access to gratuities, people there working off the side that have a lot of money because they're engaged in drugs and it's right there. There's a lot of conflict of interest, and this is a huge issue because there are so many different ways that people can be involved in a conflict of interest. There's groupthink, where they might disagree with their supervisors, but they go along with what the rest of the group says simply because they don't want to seem like the fish out of water, as it were. And there's the slippery slope argument, which is where they have unintentional outcomes because they start small, but this leads to something else. So they might take a gift from somebody, and then that leads to quite serious gifts down the track that they take without actually informing people about that gift and so on. And finally, there's unfair distribution, where they're living in areas near people that they don't necessarily want to live near. And they start to really resent those people that they are living around. There's also vulnerable areas and high-risk areas. So vulnerable areas is having access to information, driving information and being able to quite easily pass that on to third parties. And you see that all the time in the media and in different books and things where they just do that without even questioning it, and it's actually illegal conduct. There's inadequate supervisions for any range of reasons. For instance, it might be that the supervisor just wasn't able to get to work that night because they were sick. And that's the reason why there's inadequate supervision. There's also informant relationships, which we have talked about before. There's targeting by particular types of criminals because they're seen to be someone on the outer of police teams or organisations, and therefore more likely to be influenced and benefit their criminal organisations that they might have going. There's non-organisational factors as well. There's domestic or personal problems that come up. There's relationship problems. There's problems with alcohol and other drugs. There's financial difficulties, which is why graft is one of the most common forms of police corruption. There's social networks with criminals, and of course long-standing relationships because they might be informants. And then there's high-risk areas that they need to be aware of. So detectives are high-risk teams, and they might have poor process activities because there's a lack of supervision. There's traffic patrol and opportunistic bribes that might emerge. There's watch houses and assaults or deaths in custody. There's motor vehicle patrols and dangerous high-speed pursuits that come about. There's special tactics units and excessive force in raids and sieges that also emerge. For instance, they might use excessive force in the form of bashing in a window. The glass smashes all over a kid that they can't see through the window because that kid's sleeping in their bed. There's drug squads and on-selling of drugs and shakedowns of dealers and things like that, as well as planting illegal evidence. And of course, there's illicit access to misuse of confidential information. So all of these things are different forms of police corruption that might emerge. We've already talked a little bit about police culture and the importance of changing it, so I won't go into this into a huge amount of detail, but there are key things that we need to think about in terms of changing police culture. So number one, police corruption cannot just be explained away as a product of bad apples, which is one single officer within a police organisation. Poor police professional standards are pervasive and continuing and not rank bound. So it's something that we really do need to work on in a consistent manner so that we can fortify that long-term change for shifting bad police culture. There are often what we call rotten barrels, which means all the officers are involved in a specific team or a specific organisation in particular ways, and there genuinely needs to be radical change, like Baltimore, for instance. There's causes of poor professional standards. So there might be factors intrinsic to policing as a job, but some areas such as prostitution, gambling, drugs, policing might be more prone to corruption. Any definition of poor police professional standards should cover both financial and process activities, but whether or not that does and how those things are defined really changes across different jurisdictions. So this is something as well that can be focused on to change police culture. And finally, there's causes of poor police professional standards, such as poor supervision, and that can be even just supervision of a team as opposed to supervision of a police organisation or a police service or department, right? So there's a whole range of different things that might come into play. Noble cause corruption is a big one, and this is probably something we see most often in things like novels and media and in movies and things. This is the Dirty Harry syndrome, where there's a crusader police officer who wants to clean up crime, but they use corrupt methods to achieve that objective, and it often includes things like overuse of force. Police attempted to use illegal or ethically questionable means to obtain justice. So there's things like pressures to confess, misrepresentation of police powers, there's deception, there's threats and physical pressure, and there's things like being the agent provocateur. which is where they're masquerading as somebody else to lure in those people that they're trying to catch in the act. Policing gay beats is a really good example of that. So why does noble cause corruption happen? They most certainly have the opportunity to achieve some morally good end or outcome, so that's what they aim to do. The means that they use to achieve this are normally morally wrong. That's why they're dirty, the Dirty Harry syndrome. And of course, they use these means often because they might be the best, or they might be the only practical way. So the best way available to them, and the only practical way because they don't have other resources that might be available to them. So that they do these things in order to still achieve that end, even though it's not the best way of getting there. The good that's likely to be achieved by using the dirty means certainly far outweighs the evil that's likely to follow from their use. Now, the reason why we had a conversation recently about police culture is because police culture is very much intertwined with corruption, as we were discussing previously. There is something in policing that we call the blue wall of silence, which really does protect corruption. And we can see this probably in a whole manner of different examples. But one of the ones which is most prominent in Australia is most definitely the Fitzgerald inquiry and the corruption that came out of the Queensland Police Service, which I think was a force, and then their Royal Commission changed their name to a service. Now, this particular situation was unique because there were so many people at high levels that were involved in corruption, including a number of political figures, not just police officers. And they were all involved in sustaining this corruption over a very long period of time. When we think about the blue wall of silence, it's something that covers what is going on in terms of the corruption so that they can continue that corruption unimpeded. This blue wall of silence is an unwritten code that generally refers to the refusal of an officer to rat on fellow members, even if the officer has knowledge of wrongdoing or misconduct. And this is a serious thing. Ratting on police members like this has often led to various forms of harassment, but also death threats and violence from other police officers around them. So it's a really serious decision to make, to stay silent or alternatively to blow the whistle and make this corruption public. And of course, I think one of the first officers to do that was an Indigenous officer in Queensland. And he blew the whistle, and he literally walked out of that police organisation with nothing. No farewell, no thanks for everything, present, all of that sort of stuff, even though he retired many, many years after being involved in the process of blowing the whistle on Queensland Police. So it was a very serious process, and the blue wall of silence is something that is really hard to crack as a result. Although it's not part of an officer's formal training, the indoctrination of this code often begins with the start of their career, and I would argue even the training at the police academy. From the time they enter the academy, a cadet is introduced to the concept that it's unacceptable to report the misconduct of other officers. The ubiquitous nature of this code of silence in police culture and its impact on police accountability is pretty much undisputed. Several courts have even recognised the existence of a code of silence within police culture, noting that the code of silence facilitates corruption and misconduct. So it's a very serious issue, and it is something that we need to do a lot more work on. I would argue that we're getting better at it, but it really is up to the individual police organisation as to how well that stuff is activated on the ground. So a quick example of how the blue wall of silence functions. The police beating of Adolph Archie is a really good example. This particular person was suspected of killing a New Orleans police officer. Archie allegedly fired fatal shots at Officer Hawke, and the officers shot him as he fled the scene, and they said that they'd knocked him off his feet. Archie was then beaten until he was nearly unconscious. They transported him to the police station before he received treatment. And once Archie was returned to the hospital by police, he had suffered 2 skull fractures, broken teeth, a broken larynx, bleeding testicles, and other injuries consistent with being kicked. And Archie died 12 hours later from his injuries. So even though somebody has shot a police officer, we of course know that all of that other conduct is entirely illegal. But it's that blue wall of silence which enabled this. All of these officers decided that this was the best course of action to beat Archie, and then bend the processes around how a suspect is supposed to be treated in order to, I guess, seek revenge on this person shooting Officer Hawke. And of course, it's not a good thing to shoot an officer, but it's also not appropriate to beat members of the public. That's what we have court processes for, and so forth. Officers involved in misconduct, I guess, are assured that their colleagues will not reveal their misconduct for fear of retribution. And this is something that the blue wall of silence perpetuates. It very much impacts all police. It's not just an individual experience. Those who report are called rats and informers. They're subject to alienation and exclusion by other officers. They're also subject to harassment, vandalism, threats because they broke the code of silence, and therefore it breaks down that police loyalty. Paula White Ruiz was an officer who reported that her partner had been stealing money from the body of a dead male at a crime scene, and she went on to experience death threats, and a fellow officer engaged in those processes. So it's a very serious thing that we need to try and break down. And I would argue we do need to still do a lot of work on the blue wall of silence as a result. Police corruption and misconduct are most certainly a huge issue, and the links with police culture are fairly significant. So it makes it very difficult to overcome completely, but it's also very important that we do target it in certain ways, and that we keep up the focus on these things in order to be able to try and improve these circumstances. There's a lot of literature that argues it's impossible to ever completely eradicate police corruption, but we can work towards improved professional standards overall, and we can do that via ethics, which is something that we're going to talk about in the second lecture. That's it for now. Thanks for listening, folks. I hope you all got something out of that, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!